Russia didn't just invade Ukraine, it sold the world a lie and marched to war behind it. Denazification, protecting Russian speakers, pushing back against NATO, Putin's excuses were loud, polished, and everywhere. They aired nonstop on state TV, echoed in press briefings, and for a while even convinced some global audiences. Ukraine's relationship with NATO was painted as the final straw, the public-facing reason Russia would gamble its economy, its military, and its future. But none of that was the real reason, not even close. They were smoke screens, crafted distractions hiding something far more desperate, far more dangerous, and far more real. The true reasons Putin invaded Ukraine have nothing to do with extremist ideology or NATO expansion. They have everything to do with existential anxiety, economic desperation, and a dying empire's last gasp for relevance. Today, we're pushing aside the propaganda to uncover what no one talks about: the real reasons Russia started this war and why Putin can never let it end. And to do that, we need to go way back in history. 1,000 years ago, there was a medieval realm centered around what is now Kiev. This was Kievan Rus, a constellation of cities ruled by East Slavic princes who converted to Eastern Orthodoxy and created what many consider the foundation of Eastern European civilization. For centuries, historians and leaders in both Russia and Ukraine have claimed this heritage as their own. But here's where it gets interesting and why this matters today. Modern Ukrainian identity traces a direct line from Kievan Rus through centuries of separate development under Polish and Lithuanian rule. The Ukrainian language, culture, and political traditions emerged from this Western trajectory. But Russia comes from somewhere else entirely. The Grand Duchy of Moscow, which spent centuries under Mongol domination, absorbing not Ukrainian or Polish customs, but Mongol and later Chinese administrative systems borrowed through the Khan's empire. This can be traced back to the evolution of languages. Everyday words remain largely the same, sure, the words for bull, water, tree, the basic stuff of peasant life, but words of power diverged. In Ukrainian, money is hroshi, borrowed from Polish. In Russian, it's dengi, from the Turkic tanga, as Turkish and Mongol belong to the same Altaic language family. The Russian word for treasury, kazna, comes straight from the Mongols. The Ukrainian word skarbnitsia kept the Old Slavic root. Vocabulary itself reminded everyone of who ruled whom. So when Putin insists that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, he's not just being sentimental. He's attempting to rewrite history itself and erase the inconvenient truth that Russian political culture actually stems from Mongol and Chinese imperial traditions, not from the democratic, Western-oriented traditions of Kievan Rus. By conquering Ukraine, Putin is actually trying to steal Ukraine's historical legitimacy to cover up Russia's own imperial origins. This is why Putin wrote that infamous 6,000-word essay in July 2021 called on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. In it, he argued that Ukraine has no right to exist as a separate nation, that Ukrainian identity is an artificial creation of foreign powers, and that modern Ukraine is merely a project designed to weaken Russia. The University of Rochester fact-checked this essay and found that virtually every claim was either exaggerated or outright false. But facts don't matter when you're waging a war over who gets to define reality. For Russia's ruling class, Ukraine's departure from the Russian sphere isn't just a geopolitical setback. It's an existential threat to Russian identity itself. As Dmitry Trenin, the former director of the Carnegie Moscow Center, put it, losing Ukraine means the disintegration of Russia's historical heartland, leaving it incomplete. It also shatters the unity of the Russian people and Russian Orthodox civilization. In other words, if Ukraine can exist independently, successfully, and oriented toward the West, it exposes the lie that Russia is the natural heir to Kievan Rus. It reveals that Russia's imperial identity is built on conquest, not cultural continuity. But Putin's obsession with Ukraine isn't just about history books and national mythology. It's about survival in a changing world economy, and Russia is running out of time. For decades, Russia has been essentially a gas station masquerading as a country. Oil and gas exports accounted for roughly 45% of the government's entire budget in the mid-2010s, but there's a problem. The world is moving away from fossil fuels. Goldman Sachs forecasted that by 2035, 100% of new vehicle sales in the European Union and 70% in the United States will be electric vehicles. The European Union has created a roadmap to become completely independent of Russian energy by the end of the decade. China is building the Belt and Road Initiative to access Middle Eastern oil and gas directly, potentially making Russian resources redundant. And as climate concerns drive policy worldwide, the market for Russia's primary export is shrinking. So the writing is on the wall. Russia's economy can't sustain itself through gas and oil much longer, especially after the United States significantly improved its production capabilities and created closer ties to the European Union, which is Russia's biggest previous importer. The energy-dependent economic model that had kept Russia afloat since the fall of the Soviet Union is dying, and Russia has failed to diversify. That's where Ukraine becomes critically important. Ukraine is sitting on some of the most valuable natural resources on the planet. The country holds the eighth largest coal deposit in the world and the second largest in Europe, with over 38 billion tons of reserves. But here's the kicker, more than 90% of those deposits are in the Donbass region, the exact territory Russia has been obsessing over since 2014. Even more crucial are Ukraine's mineral deposits. The country has massive reserves of iron ore, roughly a quarter of the size of Russia's reserves, but in a much more compact, easier to extract area with better infrastructure. Ukraine produces significant amounts of manganese, nickel, and chromium, metals that are essential for modern industry. But the real prizes are lithium and rare earth elements. As the world transitions to electric vehicles and renewable energy, lithium has become the new oil. Electric vehicles need lithium batteries to operate, and the entire green energy revolution depends on rare earth metals. Ukraine has untapped lithium deposits and a well-developed metallurgical industry perfectly positioned to exploit them. Russia, by contrast, has minimal lithium reserves and an outdated, inefficient industrial base. Think about what this means. Russia's entire economic model is based on exporting fossil fuels that the world no longer wants. Ukraine, meanwhile, has the exact resources the world desperately needs for the next century. If Ukraine develops these resources independently, especially under Western investment and European Union integration, it can become strategically indispensable while Russia becomes obsolete. And there's more. Ukraine's natural gas reserves are estimated at around 1.1 trillion cubic meters officially, but some reports suggest the actual reserves could be nearly 5 times larger, up to 5.4 trillion cubic meters. Most of these reserves are located either in the Donbass region or under the Black Sea, both areas that Russia has targeted. If Russia gains control over the occupied territory through any peace deal, it will capture roughly 80% of Ukraine's natural gas reserves. This is another huge reason why Russia is fighting. It's about controlling the resources that will determine which countries matter in the 21st century economy. This has been one of the main drivers of war anywhere in history, and history is repeating itself. But there's another crisis driving Putin's desperation, one that gets far less attention but may be even more catastrophic. Russia is running out of Russians. Shortly before the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989, Russia's fertility rate was around 2.01 children per woman, the exact replacement level needed to maintain a stable population. But in the chaos of the 1990s, as the Soviet system collapsed and the economy imploded, the fertility rate plummeted to as low as 1.16, all the while staying under 1.4 for 14 straight years. In practical terms, Russia's population went from 148 million in 1991 to 137 million by 2022. That's 11 million people just gone, and the trend is accelerating. The United Nations estimates that Russia's population could fall to between 74 and 112 million by the end of the century. Using the pre-war figure, that means Russia could lose between 25 and 50% of its current population in the next 75 years, compared to a projected global population decline of only 20%. But it gets worse. The birth rate collapse of the 1990s and early 2000s created a generation gap. Russia now has a massive deficit of young adults in their 20s and 30s, the people who should be starting families right now. Since they don't exist in sufficient numbers, Russia is facing a positive feedback loop with extremely negative results. Fewer parents means fewer children, which means even fewer parents in the next generation. And here's the kicker: instead of solving this with immigration, Putin made it worse. Russia introduced increasingly strict immigration policies throughout the 2000s, restricting immigration by race, religion, and language. The 2002 law was particularly restrictive, and while it was loosened in 2005, Putin emphasized that Russian speakers would be prioritized. Legal immigration peaked at nearly 1.15 million in 1994, then declined each year thereafter, shrinking to only 70,000 by 2004. Putin strangled immigration because he's obsessed with maintaining Russia as an orthodox, ethnically Slavic nation. He wants people who look like Russians, speak like Russians, and think like Russians, and that's where Ukraine comes in. When the war truly escalated in 2022, Ukraine had roughly 41 million people, about a third of Russia's population. More importantly, roughly 90% are either Ukrainians or Russians, culturally and linguistically similar. Ukraine is also incredibly dense compared to Russia, with 70 people per square kilometer compared to Russia's less than 9. From Putin's perspective, Ukraine would be able to fuel Russia's economy simply due to an influx of people. If Putin's original plan had worked, if Russian forces had toppled the Ukrainian government in 3 days as intended, Russia could have annexed 40 million new citizens in a matter of weeks. Sure, Ukraine has its own fertility problems, with similar drops in the 1990s and 2000s. But Ukraine's birth rate bounced back sharply in the 2010s as the economy improved and the country oriented toward Europe. Russia would be importing not just people, but a younger, more dynamic population that could potentially reverse the demographic decline. But there's one more player in this game that nobody wants to talk about: China. And this might be the most important factor of all. Russia likes to present itself as an independent great power, a sovereign nation making its own strategic decisions. The reality is that Russia is increasingly becoming a Chinese client state, and the war in Ukraine is partly about maintaining whatever shred of independence Moscow has left. When Western sanctions hit Russia after the 2014 annexation of Crimea, Russia had to find new markets for its oil and gas. China was happy to oblige, but on China's terms. 1 year after the war started, Russia was selling natural gas to China at $271 per 1,000 cubic meters, a massive discount from the $481 it charged European markets. Russia-China bilateral trade volume reached $244 billion by mid-2024, making China Russia's largest trading partner by far. But China doesn't need or see Russia as an equal. China needs Russia as a resource colony, a compliant supplier of cheap energy and raw materials to fuel Chinese industry. And here's where Ukraine becomes crucial, not just for Russia, but for China's strategic calculus. China is the world's manufacturing powerhouse, but it desperately needs two things: secure access to energy and access to the raw materials for the green energy revolution. China is aggressively pursuing lithium, rare earth elements, and industrial metals because whoever controls these resources will dominate the 21st century economy. So we're back to the same embarrassment of riches that sit just below the surface in Ukraine. If Russia conquers Ukraine, China gains indirect control over these resources through its influence over Moscow. If Ukraine remains independent and integrates with the West, China loses access to a critical resource base. This is why China has been pushing for a peace deal that allows Russia to keep the occupied territories. China doesn't care about Putin's imperial fantasies or Russian national identity. China cares about securing resource access. A Russian victory in Ukraine, even a partial one that gives Moscow control over Donbass and the Black Sea coast, would hand China indirect control over some of the world's most valuable mineral deposits. For Putin, this creates a twisted logic. If Russia loses Ukraine, it will become completely dependent on China with nothing to offer but discounted energy. But if Russia conquers Ukraine's resource-rich regions, it has something valuable to bargain with, a way to maintain at least some leverage in the relationship with Beijing. It can completely avoid being subject to China's whims and industrial needs. But all of these practical reasons, the history, the resources, the demographics, the Chinese pressure, they all rest on a foundation of something deeper: Russia's imperial identity. And this is what makes the war truly unstoppable. Russia has been an empire for over 300 years. From the expansion under Peter the Great to the Soviet Union's domination of Eastern Europe, Russia has always defined itself by conquest and control. The brief period after 1991 when Russia wasn't actively expanding was treated as an aberration, a temporary weakness to be corrected. Putin grew up in the Soviet system, trained in the KGB, and internalized the idea that Russia's greatness comes from its territorial extent and its ability to dominate its neighbors. He genuinely believes that a Russia confined to its current borders is a diminished, humiliated Russia. There's a pattern to his aggression, too. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia and propped up separatist regions in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, ensuring Georgia could never join NATO. According to NATO rules, a country in active military conflict or territorial dispute can't join the alliance. Russia used this loophole to permanently block Georgia's Western integration. The same playbook appeared in Moldova with Transnistria, in Azerbaijan with the backing of Armenia in Nagorno-Karabakh until recently, and throughout Central Asia where Russia continues to suppress national identities and support movements aligned with Moscow. Ukraine is simply yet another country in the line of victims. But Ukraine is different in one crucial way. It's the crown jewel of the former Russian Empire. It's larger, wealthier, more populous, and more strategically important than any other former Soviet republic except Russia itself. If Putin can subjugate Ukraine, he can prove that the Russian Empire can be rebuilt. If he fails, the empire is dead forever. This is why Putin framed the invasion using World War II rhetoric, calling it a struggle against fascism, and comparing it to the Soviet victory in 1945. He's not actually fighting extremists. He's fighting for the right to claim that Russia still matters, that Russian imperial power is real, and that Moscow can still dictate terms to its neighbors. But of course, Ukraine refuses to play along. The nation Putin called artificial and not really a state has united in resistance. The Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine that Putin claimed would welcome Russian forces have instead joined the Ukrainian military. Every assumption Putin made about Ukrainian weakness, Russian military superiority, and Western indifference has proven catastrophically wrong. Which brings us to the final, most disturbing truth: Putin can't end this war. As of December 2025, after nearly 4 years of fighting, Russia has suffered staggering casualties. According to Ukrainian military estimates, Russian personnel losses have surpassed 1.2 million killed and wounded combined. Ukrainian General Staff, December 2025. Independent verification projects by BBC Russian and Mediazona confirmed over 156,000 named Russian military deaths by mid-December 2025, though they acknowledge their count represents only a fraction of actual losses. Mediazona, December 19, 2025. Western intelligence estimates place total Russian casualties at over 1 million, including up to 250,000 killed. UK Ministry of Defense, October 2025. The war has warped Russia's economy through military spending, led to international isolation, and changed the country's entire structure. Putin has staked his political legitimacy, his personal legacy, his very survival on this conflict. Ending the war without total victory would be admitting catastrophic failure. It would expose him as the leader who squandered Russia's wealth, destroyed its military, and subordinated the country to China for nothing. Putin has spent 2 decades carefully curating his inner circle with Siloviki powerful men from security services and industry who have profited enormously from his regime. These people see Putin as the vehicle for restoring Russian imperial greatness. If he suddenly turns toward compromise, they might decide he's outlived his usefulness. This isn't a long shot either. In 1991, top members of the KGB attempted a coup because they believed Gorbachev was betraying the Soviet Union. The same pattern could easily repeat. Putin's closest allies are the ones who could depose him if he starts looking like a failure. Then there's the economic trap. Russia has effectively restructured its entire economy around the war. For 2025, military spending reached 13.5 trillion rubles, approximately $140 billion, constituting 32.5% of government spending and over 7% of GDP. Russian federal budget, December 2024. For 2026, Russia's approved budget allocates 12.9 trillion rubles to defense, with total defense and security spending reaching 16.8 trillion rubles, or 38% of the federal budget. Russian federal budget, December 2025. This has created a massive constituency of beneficiaries: defense contractors, soldiers and their families, workers in industrial towns with high-paying defense jobs, and police receiving increased salaries. These people's prosperity depends on the war continuing. Ending it would crash the economy and turn millions of supporters into enemies, and Russia openly admitted that it can't keep going at the same level. The 2026 budget shows a slight reduction in military spending from 2025 levels, though it remains at historic highs. Reuters, September 29, 2025. Putin's negotiation strategy is equally telling of his intentions. In August 2025, Putin met with U.S. President Donald Trump at a summit in Anchorage, Alaska. The first time Putin had been invited to a Western country since the invasion began. Wikipedia, 2025 Russia-United States Summit. The summit ended without an agreement, though Putin later claimed he had practically agreed to Trump's proposals and that the ball was now entirely in the court of the West and Ukraine. CNN, December 19, 2025. In subsequent statements during his annual press conference in December 2025, Putin showed no signs of compromise, pledging to press ahead with military operations. Al Jazeera, December 20, 2025. He proposes ceasefires that require Ukraine to cede territory, accept neutrality, and essentially disarm while Russia keeps everything it's conquered. These proposals are designed to be rejected. Each refusal allows Russia to claim Ukraine is the obstacle to peace while justifying continued fighting. And the worst of all, Putin believes time is on Russia's side. He thinks Russia can outlast Ukraine in pure attritional warfare. Yes, on paper, Russia is bigger, tougher, and more willing to absorb casualties that would be politically unacceptable in democratic societies. But the actual mathematics is nightmarish. Recent battlefield dynamics show the grinding nature of this conflict. According to data from the Institute for the Study of War, between November 18 and December 16, 2025, Russian forces gained 215 square miles of Ukrainian territory, continuing their slow advance. Russia Matters, December 17, 2025. However, the pace fluctuates dramatically. In the week of December 9 to 16, Russia gained only 9 square miles, a six-fold decrease from the previous week's 55 square miles. Russia Matters, December 17, 2025. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces retook significant portions of the northern city of Kupiansk in mid-December 2025 despite Russian claims to have captured it, demonstrating Ukraine's continued ability to contest territory. Al Jazeera, December 19, 2025. The human cost continues to mount on both sides. Ukrainian forces have also suffered significant casualties, though exact figures remain disputed. President Zelensky stated in April 2025 that Ukraine had lost 100,000 soldiers killed. Russia Matters, December 17, 2025. The UA Losses Project, considered reliable by multiple verification organizations, documented by name 81,768 Ukrainian fighters killed as of late November 2025, plus 85,906 missing in action. Wikipedia, casualties of the Russo-Ukrainian War, December 2025. Russia's infrastructure attacks on Ukraine have intensified. In December 2025, Russian strikes on energy infrastructure left over 180,000 consumers without electricity across 5 Ukrainian regions. Kyiv Independent, December 19, 2025. The Institute for the Study of War estimated that Russia's strike campaign was close to splitting Ukraine's power grid east to west, with eastern regions at the brink of blackout. Russia Matters, December 17, 2025. On December 20, 2025, Russian ballistic missile strikes on port infrastructure in Odessa killed at least 8 people and wounded 27, part of a sustained campaign that has left over 2 million people without electricity, water, and heating. Al Jazeera, December 20, 2025. Ukraine has responded with its own strategic strikes deep inside Russia and occupied territories. Ukrainian forces struck a Russian Kilo-class submarine at the Novorossiysk naval base in the Black Sea using sea drones between December 14 and 15, 2025. Al Jazeera, December 20, 2025. On December 19, 2025, Ukrainian drones struck the Filanovsky oil rig belonging to Russian energy giant Lukoil in the Caspian Sea for the 4th time in recent weeks. Kyiv Independent, December 19, 2025. Throughout December, Ukrainian forces continued targeting Russian oil refineries, military bases, and ammunition depots across multiple regions. Wikipedia timeline of the Russo-Ukrainian War. Diplomatic efforts to end the war gained momentum in late 2025, though without breakthrough results. Following the August Alaska summit, negotiations continued with American involvement. In mid-December 2025, Ukrainian and U.S. negotiating teams met for 2 days in Berlin, with Russian officials expecting to be briefed on the results. Al Jazeera, December 19, 2025. Trump administration envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner then traveled to Miami for weekend talks, where they met separately with Russian envoy Kirill Dmitriev and Ukrainian negotiator Rustem Umerov. Al Jazeera, December 20, 2025. Despite these efforts, Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated that while progress has been made, the hardest issues remain, and only a negotiated settlement can end the war. Al Jazeera, December 20, 2025. President Trump has publicly stated he believes talks are getting close to something and described them as closer than ever to peace. Al Jazeera, December 15, 2025. However, multiple senior Trump administration officials reportedly assessed that Ukraine is losing the war and would lose if fighting continued. Wall Street Journal, cited in Russia Matters, December 17, 2025. The key obstacle remains territorial concessions, with reports suggesting Washington is pushing Kyiv to cede parts of the eastern Donetsk region, which Putin continues to demand completely. Al Jazeera, December 20, 2025. For Putin, based on current rates of progress and the territorial objectives he has stated, achieving complete conquest of Ukraine would take an impossibly long time at devastating cost. The war would literally grind up generations of Russians until both countries were shells of their former selves. For Putin, this might even be an acceptable outcome, as he could go down in history as the last Russian president willing to sacrifice everything for imperial restoration. Ultimately, Putin invaded Ukraine because he believed Russia's survival depended on controlling Ukrainian territory, Ukrainian resources, Ukrainian people, and most importantly, Ukrainian history. He needs to erase Ukraine's separate existence to validate Russia's imperial identity. He needs Ukraine's resources to replace Russia's failing energy economy. He needs Ukraine's population to solve Russia's demographic crisis. And he needs a victory, any victory, to justify his regime to the Russian people and his inner circle. But he's failed. Ukraine has proven more resilient, more united, and more capable than anyone, including Putin, imagined possible. The Russian military has revealed itself as less effective than projected, suffering from corruption and logistical challenges. The vaunted Russian economy has survived sanctions mainly by becoming increasingly dependent on China as a discounted supplier. And the world has seen that Russia's claims to great power status rest heavily on nuclear weapons and its willingness to sustain enormous casualties. The true reason Russia started the war in Ukraine is desperation. A formerly great empire is facing a collapsing economic model based on fossil fuels the world no longer wants, a demographic collapse threatening its population base, and subordination to China as a junior partner, all while being led by an aging leader who believed conquest could solve everything. That's the truth no one talks about. And that's why this war, as of December 2025, is far from over, with no clear path to resolution that satisfies all parties.